Today is Sunday, January 9th. This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And today, while I'm out for a walk, I'd like to meditate on a concept that's known as reverse engineering and talk about how it applies to homeschooling or to education in general, but I'm particularly interested in talking about its application to homeschooling. As you likely know, I am a homeschooling father. I've been homeschooling with my wife since our children were born. Our first child was born in 2000, so that was 22 years ago when we got started. Our eldest 3 children are now in college, and we've still got 7 kids at home, from ages 17 down to 7. So we've been at this quite a while, this work of homeschooling. And one thing that's different about my wife and I is that both of us are, first of all, college educated with degrees. We're both good students in college, and we both had experience as full-time classroom teachers before we ever started homeschooling. I continued teaching after our children were born. My wife stopped when our first child was born, and I continued teaching until 2008 when I started the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. By the time that I really got involved directly in my children's homeschooling, I had already had experience as a classroom teacher and school administrator. And so we approached homeschooling differently than I would say most parents approach homeschooling. And in my interaction with homeschooling parents through the years, the one thing that I've always noted is that parents get into homeschooling with no experience as teachers or school administrators. They really never understand what homeschooling actually is, and they very rarely figure out what to do. I think for many homeschooling families, the desire to homeschool is led by a mother who looks at homeschooling as a way to quote-unquote keep her babies home, or as a means of some kind of suburban social life with other ladies in the church or in the community. But the choice to enter into homeschooling, again, from my observation over the past 20 years, and I knew homeschooling families even when I was working in schools, because schools and homeschool families often have to interact for things. Homeschool kids come in for testing and things like that, or tutoring. But I rarely find that homeschooling parents understand what homeschooling is before they get started. And I rarely find that they understand how to manage a homeschool, because, as I said, they simply have no experience in education. And the key concept is known as reverse engineering. Now, the problem is that in most schools, to be frank, in most schools, the administrators and the teachers are simply there to keep some big machine moving for the sake of their own careers and paychecks. They're not philosophical people. They're not thinking about goals. They're not thinking about innovation in education. They're not thinking about efficiency or how to achieve greater things. They're simply picking up where their predecessors left off, and they're just keeping the machine going, checking the boxes of what's required for them to earn their paycheck or to be promoted to the next position in the school system. There's not a lot of philosophical thought. There's not a lot of goal-oriented thinking. It's mostly people who are just keeping the machine running day by day, repeating the same courses, the same lessons, using the same methods and materials, not just year after year, but decade after decade, regardless of what changes outside the school. And this is one of the great problems with education. And then when people homeschool, they often do the same thing. They just start thinking about checking those boxes, and they don't understand how different homeschooling is than modern schooling. They really underestimate how difficult the work of homeschooling is, and they simply don't know how to approach it. And because they don't know how to approach it, they never really get going in homeschooling. They never really succeed in homeschooling. They spend a lot of time frustrated. They spend a lot of time stressing out. It may even cause their family to be worse than other families, because the stress of homeschooling can be very real. And in the end, they accomplish very little, if they even continue for long and don't just quit and send the kids back to school, because they never really understand. They never take the time to learn and never understand what they're doing in homeschooling. I get contacts all the time from parents seeking advice, but the discussions go like this. I'll get a phone call or an email from a homeschooling mother. Let's say a phone call. And the phone call will go, "Hello, my name is Mary Smith. I have a couple of questions about your program. I'm a homeschooling mother. I have 3 children. My oldest is 15. I also have a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old. And I'd like some advice about where we should begin and how your program works." And so as soon as I hear the question, I realize that this parent has no idea what the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is. This parent hasn't asked or said anything about goals for education. This parent is just starting in the middle, as it were, with a short-sighted approach to homeschooling, looking to know what she should do to get started. And I can tell that she's already dead before she gets going, because that's not how it works. And so I stop the conversation and I back her up. And I say, "Well, thank you for calling, ma'am. What I'd like to talk about first is, what are your goals for your children's education? What would you like to accomplish as a homeschooling family?" And what I normally get in response to that question is not a carefully thought out set of goals, but a lazy, repeated set of Sunday school type answers that are passed around in homeschooling circles. We want our children to believe in God. We want our children to love the Lord. We want our children to go to heaven. We want our children to grow up and be saints. These are the kinds of responses that the parents give, and they're not serious. They're not serious responses. They're not intelligent responses. They're not even rational responses. Because the things that these parents name as their goals really aren't their goals, because they don't have any goals. These really aren't their goals because the parents don't even understand the things that they're talking about. Because if they did understand the things that they were talking about, they would know that those things are not the goals of education. Education is not the means by which someone believes in God. Education is not the means by which someone grows to love God. Education is not the means by which someone becomes a saint. Education is not the means by which someone goes to heaven. Those are lazy, insincere, unstudied Sunday school answers. And when I say Sunday school answers, what I mean is they're the answers that kids give in Sunday school classes when they're asked questions, because they think the teacher is just looking for some religious answer. One of my children, when he was younger, he didn't understand. He wasn't very good in catechism. And he was getting ready for First Communion, and my wife would be teaching him the memory work that he had to complete for his catechism lessons and sacramental preparation. And any time that he didn't know the answer to a question, he would guess the body of Christ. The body of Christ was his default guess at a catechism question. So you could ask him a question, and he would sit and look puzzled for a few seconds and then say, body of Christ? That was his default Sunday school answer. And that's what I'm talking about. When I ask parents, what are your goals in homeschooling? Most of their answers are Sunday school answers. Answers from the kid who didn't study, who doesn't know the answers, doesn't know the lesson, and is just going to guess with a phrase that he's heard and thinks might be what the teacher is seeking. Those are Sunday school answers, and these answers that I get from parents are insincere, unstudied Sunday school answers. And like I said, if the parents studied these issues that they mention, they would know that these things are not even appropriate as goals in education. And before I get into this, let me just talk about them quickly, because this is very common among Christian people. Christian people no longer study philosophy. And so all that they have, their minds, are either based on what's going around in their culture, whether it's popular culture they follow or they just follow the popular counterculture. You know, you've got the liberals on one side, the conservatives on one side. You either repeat what the liberals say or you just parrot what the conservatives say. Or you hear what a liberal says and you say the contradictory thing. And that's, for most people, they're either a liberal or a conservative. They gainsay the opponent just contradict whatever the other person says and repeat the things that the members of their party say, and they consider that to be reasonable life. They don't study philosophy. Their thoughts aren't nuanced and careful. They don't actually answer the questions that need to be answered. And then they enter into all kinds of practical affairs with their minds reacting, always reacting to what other people are doing, never actually addressing the issues directly. And if they do try to be religious because they have no philosophical foundation to draw upon, they enter into this Protestantish, oversimplified, thinking and acting based on divine revelation that, again, isn't really sincere or studied. It's just sort of repeating things that they've heard. And this is the problem with the modern Christian mind. It's reactionary, it's shallow, it's unstudied, it's immature. And when new problems arise, or when problems arise in our lives that require creative solutions because our circumstances are never the same as other people's circumstances, they don't have the ability to solve the problems. They look around, they see what other people are doing, and they try to find someone to imitate. And that's how modern Christians tend to solve their problems. When we look at these issues like believing in God, loving God, being saints, going to heaven, if we would actually study these topics, we would find that education is not the means by which these things are brought about. In fact, it's impossible for us to bring about the salvation of other people. It's impossible. It's impossible for us to cause someone to be saved by instruction. It's impossible. And when people talk like this, they deny the whole point of the gospel, which is that human beings are saved by the action of God in their individual souls. When Jesus was alive and teaching on earth, he said, "No one can come to me unless my Father draws him. No one can come to me unless my Father draws him." And so when Jesus woke up in the morning, he never said to himself, "My goal today is to make people believe in God," because Jesus knew that that's impossible. He never woke up and said, "My goal today is to make people love God," because that's impossible. He never said, my goal today is to make people saints," or "My goal today is to make people go to heaven." What he did say was, "My food and drink is to do the will of my Father in heaven." And this is the first thing that Christians have to learn. They have to learn that these lazy, unstudied, fake Sunday school answers don't impress anyone who actually studies the faith. These fake Sunday school answers will never solve the real problems in life. And until we become sincere in our Christian life and don't just parrot things that we've heard, things we think the questioner might be looking for, but things we don't understand, until we become sincere enough to study and speak rightly about the Christian faith and make realistic goals that are actually reasonable considering the true teaching of the Christian faith, we're just playing games. And this is what I find in most homeschool families. They're just not serious. They may be serious in their intentions, generally speaking, but in the actual work of education, they're not serious. So my first question for parents, I always stop them as they are eager to start buying things and signing up for services that I know that they will never be able to succeed in because they don't even understand what needs to be studied or how difficult real studies are or how much time will be required or how many years they'll need to work on these things. I stop them and ask them for their goals. And almost always I get these lazy Sunday school answers, as if the parents are trying to impress me by guessing the right things to say. And my advice to the parents is to first stop and figure out what the goals of education actually are, what the goals of homeschooling actually are. Because until you figure that out, you're just playing games. You're just wasting money. You're just wasting time. And it's not going to work. It's not going to work. I don't have the car salesman spirit where I could just ignore that and grab the available money. I try to actually help the parents to fix the problems. And usually they're not interested in fixing the problems. They wish I would just get out of the way and let them do what they want. And many of them do that. I'll talk to them on the phone for an hour and then watch as they go online and do everything I told them not to do because they don't care what I've said to them. A person who desires to succeed in something begins by setting goals. The first step of any successful undertaking is to set clear goals, to know what the goals are. The reason why it's important to set goals, two reasons really, why it's important to set goals. And I know everyone imagines that they already know this, but they don't practice it. And they don't practice it because they really don't know it. They don't understand it. They think they do, but they don't. And you can see that they don't because they don't practice it. But there are two important reasons why goals need to be set. And we need to spend more time on this work of setting goals than trying to figure out what book we should buy or what course we should sign up for. Because if we figure out the goals, if we get the goals right, then we can succeed, and all the other decisions, all the other challenges, all the other tasks become easy. But if we get the goals wrong, we're just always lost in a fog. And this is where I would argue most homeschool families are. They're lost in a fog. they really don't know what they're trying to do. They really don't know what the goals are. And while they pretend to have a plan, if you start poking around, asking questions about the plan, you'll quickly see that there's no plan. They haven't taken the time. They haven't done the work to set the goals for the education of their children. Many of the goals they set are irrational and are just guaranteed to fail, what we call a fool's errand, an impossible task. Not impossible because we're doubting one's ability, but impossible because that's not how it even works. And this is usually the case when parents give Sunday school answers for the goals of the education of their children. While I'm on that topic, let me mention that I gave a talk a while back titled Christian Education Should Focus on Philosophy, Not Religion. And I recommend, if you're interested in getting more into this topic, you find that video and give that one a listen. So the first reason why it's important to set goals, good goals, real goals, is because they allow us to then map out a plan for how we can achieve that goal. It allows us to move from a solid, achievable goal to practical, measurable steps that we need to take to get from where we are to that goal. That's the first benefit of having right goals in education. If we have right goals, achievable goals, we can then map out an achievable plan of objectives and tasks to move from where we are to where we want to be. And they have to be achievable. The goals have to be achievable. The objectives have to be achievable. The tasks have to be achievable. All of this has to be achievable and therefore measurable. If we allow ourselves, or if a husband allows his wife to set some unachievable, immeasurable goal, the homeschool thing is just going to run in circles. There's going to be no up or down, no front or back, no way to assess progress or failure, because there's no realistic goal, there's no realistic plan, there's no ability to measure progress. And many parents, I think, want it to be so that they're never held accountable. I think many parents like it like that because they can just talk baloney every day and pretend to be doing something that they're not. And as long as they can avoid any measurable accountability, they can continue talking and passing around the baloney, pretending that they're doing something when really they're just flying by the seat of their pants, running in circles every day, doing whatever they want, with no accountability. And I think many homeschooling mothers like it that way. They're just doing their own will, and they pretend that there's some plan, but if you ask for it, you'll find that there's no plan. And I encourage fathers not to be jerks and criticize what their wives are doing, because after all, it's the father's responsibility to set these goals and lay out this plan. So I'm not telling fathers that they should be critics, because it's their responsibility in the first place. But I do recommend that fathers hold their wives accountable to measurable goals and objectives and tasks, that there be measurable plans with some accountability for progress, and not that homeschooling just become this giant money pit where every expense is justified. Weeks and months go by where there's no perceivable progress, and really there's not even any goals for what the homeschool mother is doing. Husbands need to keep their wives accountable and realize that this is the education of our children we're talking about. This isn't some game to be played. This isn't some social activity or some personal adventure to be undertaken. This is the education of our children. The first benefit of setting goals is that it allows us to set achievable, measurable plans for how to achieve those goals. It makes everyone accountable. The kids can understand what the goals are. The kids can understand what the objectives are. The kids can understand what the tasks are and why the tasks are necessary. Everybody knows what's going on. Everyone's accountable. That's the first step. If you were to go into a modern school and ask the teacher, what's the goal, you'd find the same kind of nonsense answer, because they're just hirelings and they don't think beyond what they need to do to keep their job. The same thing is done in homeschooling. But if you want to do homeschooling rightly, you need to set achievable, clear goals that will allow you to then create plans of action, objectives, which are intermediate steps or short-term goals along the way, and tasks, which are the individual steps that you take to move from objective to objective on your way to achieving the goal. The second benefit of goals, the second benefit of setting clear, reasonable, achievable, measurable goals, is that when you know that your goals are right, when you know that your goals are achievable, when the going gets tough, you'll be able to persevere because you know what the goal is. Having clear goals, achievable goals, gives us hope. And that hope helps us when the going gets tough, when things get crazy, when homeschooling gets difficult, when you get to boring lessons that you just have to motor through. Remembering what the goal is, what the plan is, and where we are on that plan helps us to persevere through those difficult spots. So the two benefits of setting good goals: first of all, it allows us to create a plan, and secondly, it helps us to overcome difficulties, to persevere and succeed in the long term. Those are the two reasons why real goals are necessary. In the Sunday school, lazy answers won't work and can't be accepted. Now, once we establish those goals, and again, goals have to be things that are within our power, within our control, things that we can actually accomplish. And that's why I said, talk about salvation and heaven and sainthood and supernatural virtues like faith and love are not appropriate for the goals of education. You could say that's your desire for your children is that they will grow to know and love God and believe in God. Obviously, that's every Christian parent's desire for their children. But we're talking specifically about education. We're not talking about general desires for life, because the faith and salvation and spiritual lives of our children are dependent on many things outside of education. And it's actually part of a false way of thinking that would lead parents to think that what children need to be saved is just the right education. That's not true. That assumes false things about the nature of our children, that it assumes that our children are just sort of these innocent, good, empty vessels, and if we put the right information of them, they're like robots and they'll just march on happily to eternal life. And that's not true. That's not true. Our children are fallen. They are corrupt by nature. They have concupiscence, which is an inclination to sin that they inherit through birth, that remains with them for their entire life. They will always sin. They will always need to confess their sins and do penance and amend their lives, and that will be a process that they will continue for their entire lives if they're going to be saved. The idea that knowing the right stuff makes a person a Christian is a Protestant false teaching. The idea that we go around giving out theology quizzes to everyone, and whoever gets a question wrong is damned, and whoever gets all the questions right is saved, is false teaching. That's not how salvation works. We're saved by the mercy of God. We believe in God because God actually gives us the grace of faith. We hope in God because God gives us the grace of hope. And we love God and our neighbor because God gives us the grace of love. These are called the theological virtues. You can't give those things to your children. You can model them for your children. Your children can experience what life feels like in the presence of a Christian adult, and they can compare that to what life feels like in the presence of unbelievers, and hopefully they feel and experience a difference. And that may help them, but ultimately the individual child is going to grow up and will have to choose freely to seek God. And if he or she doesn't make that choice, there's going to be nothing that you can do about it. You can continue to prevent them from entering into some kind of scandalous sin, some kind of visible public sin. You can dress them up. You can keep them away from the bad people. But all of that sheltering and protecting and covering up only lasts for so long. And once the children reach adulthood and they gain the freedom to pack up and leave home, what they really are will be manifest. What they really want to be as individuals will be manifest. And you won't be able to control it. And that's why it's important for us to understand what true goals of education are, so that we don't waste our time and energy doing things that are unreasonable and that will be unfruitful, but we do the things that actually are necessary and helpful in the long run. I'm not going to talk about those goals in this talk, but we have to establish those goals first. What I am going to talk about, what the topic of this conversation is this idea of reverse engineering. And I've already mentioned the principles of it. But the problem that many people have, when we talk about the need to learn to solve problems in education, we say it's important that people have to learn to be problem solvers. If we read Homer's work, The Odyssey, we learn that Odysseus was praised for one virtue that he possessed, and that virtue was resourcefulness. He was resourceful. He was able to solve problems. He could be faced with a problem that had never been experienced before, and he could find a solution to that problem. He was resourceful. And this challenge of solving problems is what should separate man from all other animals. All other animals are simply created by God with instincts, with what the ancient philosophers called nature, to do certain things. If they're put in circumstances that they're not created for, they simply die. A cow, for example, grazes in a field, produces milk, nurses calves. That's what it does by creation. That's what it was designed to do. If you put the cow in the grass field, it will eat the grass and will do what a cow does. If you take the cow and put the cow in a desert or in Alaska, the cow will not figure out a way to survive and solve its problem. It will simply die. Man, because he possesses the faculty of reason, is able to solve problems, is able to actually cause his environment to become livable. And this goes to such a crazy extreme that we see men like Elon Musk trying to figure out how we can make other planets habitable. That's what man is. Man is a problem-solving creature. He was given this faculty of reason at the time of creation so that he could keep the garden, that he could tend the ground and care for it, that he would have dominion over all the animals that God had created, dominion over all the earth. He was the caretaker of them. He had to figure out, by the use of reason, how to manage the things that God created. This is the duty of man. Not to invent his own world, but to understand God's intention for everything and to put everything and keep everything in its place according to the principles revealed in God's will. Education is a certain kind of ordering. And the challenge of education is that our circumstances in education are always unique. The circumstances are always unique. The idea of having an assembly line, one-size-fits-all program that you just stick kids in and they pop out on the other side is irrational, inhuman, and unrealistic. It's why the modern school idea will never ever succeed. And yet when we look at homeschool programs, we find that they do the same exact thing, just at home. They don't solve the problem. They don't address the problem. They don't come up with a solution for the problem. They just do the same dumb thing at home. The goals are not set. The circumstances are not taken into consideration. And a plan is not drafted that can lead an individual student to success, which is the whole purpose of homeschooling. In real education, circumstances always vary. Children have different strengths and weaknesses. Children have different interests, different personalities. They have different physical bodies. They're different. Every single child is different. What's the same about them is that they're human beings. They're rational animals. They're creatures made in the image and likeness of God. But outside of that, we find that the variety among human beings, among individuals, is really profound. We're all very different. My own children, from one to the next, completely different individuals, completely different personalities, completely different strengths and weaknesses, different interests, on and on. If I were to send all of my children to the same school, it would be ridiculous to even consider, because they're so different. And God's intention for their lives is bound up in this unique personality. And my job as a teacher and as a father is to cultivate what's good in them, not to destroy or remove what's unique about them, but to cultivate their lives, their intellectual lives, their personal lives, to cultivate them, to try and discern and bring out what it is that God intends for each one of them. The circumstances of their education are different because they are different. And in order to have a realistic plan for their education, I have to know what the goals are. And some of the goals are common for all of them, but some of the goals are not the same. Because as I said, goals need to be achievable. And you will find that for one child, one thing is achievable, and for another child, that thing is not achievable. It doesn't matter how much all of these fruity people in modern society want to puff up all of this, everybody's equal, you can do anything. That's not true. And it's cruel, in fact, to say to someone who measurably cannot do something that the only reason he doesn't do it is because he just doesn't want to or isn't trying hard enough. To watch things like, and this is a personal opinion, but to watch children in things like the Special Olympics, children who are born crippled or injured, disabled, trying to perform what we're calling normal activities, as if achieving those things will prove that they're valuable, I think is cruel. Because we've invented some goofy sport or game, now all of a sudden that human invention is now a measure of whether or not you have any value. And in order for a person with one leg to be valuable, he needs to act like people who have two legs. Or to have a mentally disabled person, in order for him to prove that he's valuable, he has to be able to do things that people without his troubles happen to do. That's not a Christian idea. We don't need crippled people to dribble basketballs to prove their worth. In fact, they have a role to play in society, in God's will, that's something altogether different. I'm not going to get into that, but it's an example of how we impose on people an artificial, one-size-fits-all culture that isn't our right to do. And we do the same thing in education. And it's wrong. Now, what modern schools do to deal with the problem of individuality is they grade all the children. And so a child who's not good at this or that will simply get lower grades, like it's some kind of quality control inspection facility. And if you're bad enough, we'll stick a label on you and mark you defective. Or we'll drug you until you start to act like the other kids. Because we have created this completely artificial system of education that's only been around for 150 years, and we've decided to now use this as the measure of your humanity and value to the community. And homeschooling families, for all their talk, do the same thing. The parents will get on the phone and start asking me questions about report cards and grades. Just running in circles without even asking the question, why would you be giving your child a grade? The challenge of homeschooling, which is just real education, it's just real education. It's just parents taking responsibility for the education of their children. Homeschooling requires that we understand that the circumstances for each child's education are different, and that we set goals that are achievable for those individual students, and that we then map out a plan for their education that leads them as individuals from where they are to where they need to be. Now, because we set these goals based on their strengths and weaknesses, interests, personalities, and things like that, we can hold them accountable to them. We're not asking them to make bricks with no straw. We're not asking them to do things that are impossible. We're asking them to do things that are possible. And that's what allows us to push them. If I know that a student can do something, I can distinguish between laziness and disability. They're very different things. And a parent has to know their children well enough to understand whether we're dealing with a real disability. And I'm not talking about modern school disabilities and all that nonsense. I'm talking about real, natural, personal disabilities. We have to be able to distinguish in our children whether the problem is disability, or I should say impossibility, or whether it's simply the will. And we have to also remember that if the will not be corrected, if the person is not willing to change his will, the goals are going to need to change. This is another place where I think homeschool parents mess up. If you have a child and you have high ambitions for a child because it's your child, not because he shows signs of being able to achieve those things, but just because you are sort of prideful and arrogant and you think that every one of your children should be a priest and a doctor of the church or a Harvard professor, and you just assume that all of your children should do this or that because they're your children, and you find that you've got a child who simply will not obey. You're going to have to change the goals, or you're just going to spite yourself. You're just going to spite yourself and end up giving your child a worse education than you could have had you adjusted your goals to address the problem with his will. So, we see the challenge that exists in homeschooling. Schools don't do these things because it's not their job. But you as a homeschooling parent, responsible for the education of your individual children, can't say, it's not my job. It is your job. And so as a homeschooling parent, you've got to set achievable, realistic, reasonable goals for each child, and you need to map out a plan whereby you will lead those children to achieve those goals over time. Some of your children, because of their ability or their will need to have inferior goals set for them. Other children, because of their eagerness to do good and their ability to do good, can have goals set much higher. And you'll find that the children for whom goals can be set higher won't require more effort from you for them to achieve those goals. And if you set goals for children who are disobedient or disabled, you'll find that the balance of work in your homeschool will be manageable because it's reasonable and realistic. What reverse engineering is, to get to this topic, we're already close to an hour. What reverse engineering is starting at the goal and working backwards to the present. Starting with the goal and working backwards to the present. If you don't have realistic goals, you can't reverse engineer a project. A good example of reverse engineering, a good illustration, is the work that Elon Musk does in Tesla and SpaceX. He's a good example of a person who understands reverse engineering. When Elon Musk wants to do something, one of the reasons why he's so successful is because he doesn't look around at what other people are doing and react to it like most homeschoolers and schools do. He doesn't simply look at what's being done and think about how he might do it better. That's what most people do, and it's why they don't come up with any innovations, make any breakthroughs, solve any problems. They're just following a crowd, doing something that's already being done, and making subtle changes to it that make no real difference in the big picture. But what Elon Musk does, and he talks about this quite a bit, if you've never listened to Elon Musk, I encourage that you do so. He's not a Christian. I'm not telling you to go to him for spiritual direction. But what you'll find in his thinking is that there are principles that are very helpful in the Christian life. And like I said, the problem with modern Christian thinking is that modern Christians are not philosophical. They don't have practical, real-world wisdom. They often live in something of a fairyland where they rely entirely on divine revelation, and Christians were never intended to live like that. They were intended to live by faith and reason. But Elon Musk, if you listen to him talk, what you'll find is that he practices reverse engineering. So when he sees a problem that he's interested in solving, he doesn't look around and see what other people are doing and try to improve on it. He starts from scratch. He establishes the goal, making sure that it's an achievable goal. He establishes the goal, and then he basically imagines what would be necessary to achieve that goal. And then he sets about figuring out how to do what he imagined. He sets the goal, thinks about what needs to be done to achieve that goal, and then works backward from the goal to the present and creates a plan or a roadmap for how that goal can be achieved. And like I said, he doesn't care what other people are doing. He doesn't care what methods other people are using. He doesn't care what materials other people are using. He approaches his problem fresh. Reverse engineering, working from the problem back to the present. And that's why he's worth today, $200 billion or more? Why he's achieving things that other people can't even imagine achieving, because they're simply doing the same thing as everyone else, and he is working outside of that box, actually aiming directly at the problems with innovative, resourceful, unique solutions. He's resourceful. He's doing this with electric cars. He's doing this with space exploration and the production of reusable rockets. He's got some wacky ideas, of course, because he has his own sort of philosophy and vision of the world and humanity. But when it comes to problem solving, no one can deny that he's amazing. And there's a lot for us to learn from him, from his method, to apply in our own lives. And wise Christians through history did the same thing, which is why they accomplished amazing things. But in homeschooling, we have to reverse engineer the education of our children. We have to set goals for them, and those goals need to be personal. They need to be individualized. There are some things that will be in common, but it needs to be personalized. Let me give you an example. What I always tell parents is that if they have sort of the guts to do this, I say, your children may all be different, but there are some things about them that are all the same. They're all human beings. They're all rational animals made in the image and likeness of God, designed for God. They need an education that helps them to fulfill this purpose. You cannot give them faith. You cannot give them hope. You cannot give them charity. You cannot make them obedient, faithful Christians. You cannot make them saints. You cannot bring them to heaven. But there are things that you can give them. You can give them an objective knowledge of divine revelation. That is within your power. You can give them an objective knowledge of the philosophical sciences. You can teach them and train them in the use of the faculty of reasoning. This is the purpose of the ancient curriculum. The ancient curriculum was designed by men who understood these things. It was realistic, achievable educational program. It's why I'm working to restore it. It was created by men who were wise and who understood all these things. There's no grade level, there's no timetable, because these men understood that all students are different. They need the same truth, but they need to be able to pursue it at their own pace. Notice I didn't say in their own way. That's modern stupid talk. There is one truth needed by all students, and they all need to be able to pursue it, not in their own way, that makes no sense, but at their own pace. Individualized education, which is what homeschooling is, needs to be self-paced. We need to reverse engineer the educational plan from the unique goals for our individual children, knowing that there are some things that they all need in common and that they will be able to obtain them at different paces. They need a self-paced study program that was designed by wise men who understand, or I should say understood, the true goals of education and the unique challenges of individualized education. And we find that plan of education in the classical liberal arts curriculum. So I can say that the Classical Liberal Arts Academy provides parents with a plan that allows them to provide their children with what they all need in a way that they can actually all individually follow. They can work towards the same truth at their own pace. That's why I'm always preaching against grade level education. This stupid idea that children should be grouped by their date of birth and put on a year-by-year schedule of grade levels, and at the end of the year just given a grade. That's irresponsible. We're not responsible to grade our children. We're responsible to lead our children to the end of their education. And we're to lead them individually, uniquely, personally to that end. We cannot imitate the modern schools, which have created foolish systems of learning that simply grade children like a quality control inspection center. But we are the teachers. We're the ones responsible not to assign the child a failing grade, but to lead the child to the knowledge and mastery of the necessary content. I used to say to my students, if you went to a pizza parlor and the guy claimed to be a pizza maker, wouldn't you expect him to make pizza? Wouldn't you expect him to produce the pizza? He claims to be a pizza maker. He should make pizza. In the same way, a teacher should be a person who makes children learn. It should be a person who makes students succeed. And in order to do that, the teacher needs to work with the materials that he's given, and that includes the students themselves, to understand that they're different, but to understand that there are essential needs that they have that are achievable for any human being, but a unique plan will be necessary for each of those children to achieve those things. And this is why I recommend homeschooling, not because what homeschoolers do is better than schools. That's demonstrably false. Most homeschool students end up with an inferior education to what they could have had if they were in a school. And I know some will say, oh, well, the average student that's irrelevant. Why would a homeschool student in a Christian family with parents dedicated to education have his educational achievement compared to the average student in a public school where those schools take any student who shows up on the front step? The fact that homeschool parents or homeschool publishers compare their achievements with the achievements of the public schools is nuts. You should compare the achievement of homeschoolers with the achievement of school children whose parents are as engaged in their children's education as homeschool parents are. And you'll see that those school students far outperform homeschool students. But that's because homeschool parents don't have a plan. And what they do is pretty stupid. They simply imitate the public school at home with no plan, no thinking, no reason. They don't solve the problem. They simply copy and pretend they're going to do something different, something better by changing this book and that book and this book and order from this catalog and that. And that's just nonsense. That's not how problems are solved. The curriculum and the plan that we need to give children a true Christian education individually is already provided for us in the classical liberal arts curriculum. That's what it was designed for. We simply need to initiate our children into that study program, which we make available freely in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Every single parent can get a child started studying the ancient Christian course of studies, which was developed and designed by history's wisest men. And they can pursue that course of education at their own individual pace, with all kinds of options that allow parents to help each of their children individually succeed. For example, if you have a child who's going to be a low achiever, you can have that child work through the classical liberal arts curriculum in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy for free, simply studying lessons and taking online quizzes, and it's free. There's no use investing more in the education of an unwilling child. And you can try to fight and punish that kid and you're just going to find that you're fighting against nature itself. There's going to be another child who wants to learn more and learn more and learn more, and mentally he's gifted and he's motivated and he wants to study, and mom can't keep up. And for that student, mom can either leave him without the challenges that he needs and wants, or in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, she can subscribe him to a student plan so that his assignments can be graded and he can get feedback and communicate with someone else. She can sign him up for a premium student plan and have him have weekly meetings with a tutor, sign him up for tutoring and let him have this relationship basically with me. And because I'm a gifted teacher, I can work with students like that and just challenge them and challenge them and challenge them and provide them with access to a person who probably, like them, never gets intellectually tired. Because that's the kind of challenge that those kids need. But all of those options are available. They're available, as I say, cafeteria style, for parents to use to successfully serve their individual children in different ways, according to their different needs. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, parents can reverse engineer their children's education. They can start them all off at the same place and allow them to move at their own pace with a constantly adapting curriculum plan that allows them to add more studies, reduce studies, add services, avoid services, that makes the education affordable for the parents and makes the services only necessary for the students who are going to actually use them. And if parents will learn to think about education rightly and understand what it means to set realistic goals and reverse engineer the education so that the students are doing today what will allow them to progress towards those goals, they'll see that everything is already prepared for them in the Classical Liberal Arts curriculum. And in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we add to that classical education the needs of Catholic catechesis, of modern requirements, and things like that. So we enrich that classical study program and bring it into alignment with modern society, modern culture, modern professional life and vocations. But what parents need to do is set realistic goals. The goal of education is not to raise saints. That's lazy Sunday school talk. The goal of Christian education, the goal of homeschooling, is to teach your children the classical liberal arts. That's achievable. That's realistic. That's in your control. That's why it was the focus of the schools that saints and wise men studied at and taught. Teach them the classical liberal arts. Teach them the objective knowledge of the Catholic faith. Teach them the sacred scriptures. You can't make them believe the sacred scriptures. You can't make them obey the sacred scriptures, but you can teach them the sacred scriptures. That's your duty. Teach them moral philosophy. Teach them the reasons for right moral behavior. Teach them the catechism of the Catholic Church. Teach them what the Catholic Church actually teaches so that when they become adults and make decisions about religion and church, they actually have an accurate knowledge of what the church teaches, and they're not listening to goofballs tell them what the church teaches, which the church doesn't necessarily teach. There are objective goals in education that are within your power as a parent, and you need to make them your goals so that you can create a realistic, measurable plan of homeschool study and know day by day that you're on the right path and marching towards those goals. As I said before, I'm not talking about what those goals should be in this talk. That's a much more complex topic for discussion, especially when it applies to different individual children. But I'm happy to help you work through those things as a parent. But the beginning is simple. The beginning is simple. All the children start at the same place. That's what's different about the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. When parents come in and they say, I've got a 17-year-old, a 10-year-old, and an 8-year-old, where do I start? And they're expecting me to say, oh, well, the 17-year-old starts in grade 11, and the 10-year-old is going to start in grade 4. But that's foolishness. The first question is, what are your goals? And I ask that as a test. If the parent were to give the right answer, I would say, all of your children should start at the beginning of the classical liberal. I don't care how old a child is. I don't care that the child was in 3rd grade last year. That's all artificial, irrelevant nonsense. Does the child learn the art of grammar in that school? No. Well, then he needs to learn it. Does the child study the art of reasoning in that 10th grade class? No. Then it doesn't matter that he's 17. He needs to learn the art of reasoning. That's the objective goal in a Christian education. They all need to start at the beginning. And what I tell the parents is just sign the kids up for free, get them all started, and get going. Because the plan has already been mapped out by wise men. As the kids get going, just focus on the task at hand. Focus on the next task. And then we can start to talk about what this individual student should aim for, what this individual student should aim for, what service this individual student might need, and so on. And we can, over time, develop an increasingly clear and individualized plan for each child, working backwards from the goals to where they're at, how much time they have, and so on. But getting started is easy, and the reason why I don't spend a lot of time working with parents up front is because I don't believe that the parents will actually do the things we talk about. And so I wait. I choose to make parents and students do their part first. And if you're willing to take step 1, then I'm willing to help with step 2. And when you've reached step 2, I'll be there and I'll help you with step 3. But I'm not going to talk about step 9 when you haven't yet taken step 1. And I don't get into all that homeschool conference talk and all of this talk about education and talk about this and about that. I don't do that because people won't do it. If you want to get started, take step 1. And when you take step 1, we can talk about step 2. Set realistic goals, and if you don't know what those goals are, then trust that the wise men of the past who designed the system of education for Christian children, trust that they did know what the right goals were. And the way that they set up the system was the right way. And trust in their wisdom and go back and get on that right path. Start at step 1. I've made that program available for free for Christian children. Start on the right path at the beginning, and then we can talk about how we can serve these individual children in the best way possible and help them to achieve real, individualized Christian goals in education. I hope that's helpful. As I said, the path is laid out for us. Wise men have already done the work of reverse engineering in Christian education. That's why it's nothing like what modern schools offer. That's why Christian homeschooling should not be like modern school with some superficial changes. That's not how problems get solved. We have to return to the classical liberal arts. We have to trust in the wisdom of history's wisest men, in the doctors of the church, men who worked to change the world through Christian education, and realize that as long as Christians continue imitating the world in its foolish school philosophy and methods, this death of Christian culture is just going to continue to spread. And if we want to restore the intellectual greatness that we see through Christian history, and even before Christian history, in classical Greece and Rome and the ancient world, where there were wise men, we have to be willing to step out of this sinking ship and get back on the shore where we belong. We have to reverse engineer Christian education. And the wise men have already done the work for us. We simply need to follow their path. God bless.